Okay, now let's do a thing where we speak word for word, okay? This will be really fun.
What are we doing? We're going to coordinate ahead of time what we're going to say?
Yeah, we can talk about how chat should be donating.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey,
Chat
you
absolutely
must
take
your
little...
wallet
from
your
minuscule
pocket
and
pull
out
your
gargantuan
credit
device
and
enter
the
numbers
into
the chat.
the chat.
We need you to post. We need you to
we
post.
need those-
we need
we
you
need
to post.
16
We need you to
silly
post those numbers. We need you to post those little numbers in the chat for us. We need you to just let them rip. Yep.
Don't forget the expiration date and the CVC.
Yep.
Put it all in Twitch chat right now.
And also your mother's
Is
maiden
this
name.
against terms of service?
No.
Are we doing a scam?
No.
Great. Well, on that note, I will welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always. Well, no, actually not as always, because my normal co-host, Anthony, is sick. By the time you're listening to this, he'll be much better, so don't bother saying get well soon to him, because he will be better by then. But I am joined by my other most frequent co-host, which is Parker Nomadic Lamascus.
Hey, glad to be here. Anthony, glad you're feeling better. Huh?
By now, he better be. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble. So I sincerely hope by now he's feeling a lot better. Otherwise, things have gone very badly.
Yeah, we'll miss you, but glad you're rested.
Yeah, I hope he gets some rest and feels better soon. Parker, we're here talking about the standard rotation retrospective, basically, which is a thing we devised many years ago, and then they sort of changed how standard was rotating, and so the sort of pattern of like the timeline of how they got actually released changed a little bit. But we're basically looking back at the sets that rotated out of standard semi-recently. By the time this episode comes out, it will have been like, 5 or 6 weeks ago. But this only happens, once a year, so still worthwhile. And our sort of thesis is that this is a good time for people to pick up cards for their cube, because a lot of these cards maybe have dropped off in price a little bit as they're no longer relevant in their relative standard and constructed formats. And it's also a good opportunity just to kind of look back on the perspective surveys that we have our listeners submit, that we also submit for our own cubes, and just see where we were right and where we were wrong, and see if there's an opportunity to learn about our own card evaluation skills and where we often misjudge them.
Mm-hmm. Every time we've done this survey in the past, or this retrospective, it's really been striking how much my opinions have evolved since the time that I did this pre-release survey. So it's a really good time to like check in with my own biases and my own kind of assumptions about my cube.
Where do you want to start, Parker? We have your article that you put together, which includes all of the sort of data, the analytics, basically. And for those that haven't checked out these articles in the past, I highly recommend it. It is really deep and interesting to look at. And this particular retrospective involves the most sets ever from a standard rotation, correct?
That we've surveyed.
Yes, right.
We're talking 14 sets. And that includes, by the way, stuff that wasn't strictly standard legal, like the Commander decks, and Lord of the Rings was also in this time period. Those weren't standard legal, but we're still evaluating them. Just, it's the right opportunity to do so.
Yeah, they're just in that window.
So that means 14 sets. And I looked at how many non-reprint cards were printed for the first time during this time period. We're talking over 2,100 unique cards. And that's 5 cubes worth. Like, you could make 5 unique cubes
fully
without
singleton.
ever reusing a card just from this time period. That's a lot of cards. And it's maybe the biggest ever. It might be the all-time biggest because of the way that they're changing the standard rotation moving forward. I'm not sure exactly how that'll work out, but there was a lot of cards, and it was surprising to see that many.
Yeah, for those of you that are following along just listening, or maybe can't look at the article right now, the sets we're covering are basically Dominaria United up through and including the Lord of the Rings set, which is DMU and the corresponding commander decks, the Brothers War, Unfinity, Warhammer 40k, Jumpstart 2022, Phyrexia All Will Be One, March of the Machine, and Lord of the Rings, and of course all of the corresponding commander products that match all those sets. So those are the sets we're talking about, and we're going to talk about the most overrated, most underrated cards from these sets for most Cube designers, and also our own personal hits and misses and just favorite cards from this block.
Okay, so let's start at the very top level. For all of these sets, all 14 of them, we tend to see that the most popular cards from the prospective survey have decreased in play rate. So, for example, Dominaria United, the top card from that set, just in terms of the number of people testing it, was Cut Down. It's an uncommon cheap removal spell. Followed by Ether Channeler, who's like a Mana War bounce creature, and then Cult Conscript, that is a recursive 1 mana 2/1 in black. These were the top three cards. All three of them are seeing less play now, proportionally, than they were during prospective survey. If you think about it, that makes total sense because they were the most popular. They had the furthest to fall.
Right.
And a lot of people will test it just because of the hype train. Like, they saw it on Twitter or Blue Sky. And, maybe it's a card that pros are talking about in their standard articles. And so, you test this, it seems exciting, but then, 14 more sets came out just in this year. And then a bunch more have come out since then. And so if that card didn't live up to the hype, it's really easy to cut. And when you sum that up, that means that most cards are seeing less play now than they were just before they came out.
Which is a trend we've noticed in these surveys, across all of them historically. It's just that people overestimate the number of cards they're going to play from a new set, which makes sense because they're excited about the new cards. But then, just 2 months later, there's a whole new batch of new cards to be excited about, and something's got to go to make room for those. So pretty common pattern we see across all of our survey responses.
And I think another pattern on top of that is that the more aggressive a card is and the more bread and butter staple, I also think it's more likely to see less play than the rest of the cards in the set. So Cult Conscript is a good example. I think with aggro decks, often Cube curators are oh, it's boring to play, or, there's not a lot of synergy. And so a new aggressive threat seems really appealing at first. But then when that gets boring again, you're looking for more churn in an aggro deck relative to a mid-range or control deck where maybe some of the play patterns are a little more variable. And for what it's worth, I don't necessarily agree with the characterization that aggro is boring, but I do think a lot of people are often looking for a fresh look for their aggro decks.
And maybe another way to put that is just that a lot of Cube curators at any given moment are playing the 1 mana 2-power creature du jour, and that card is not a card they're married to, but is likely to just get swapped out when another one comes along because they play a similar enough role that they're more fungible than, some 4 mana planeswalker or something that does something more unique.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And especially if you're chasing marginal power upgrades, if you're trying to play at the peaks of power, it's really easy to make those cuts when the oldest one isn't working out as well and they've power corrupted a little bit, Ragavan has come out or whatever, and so you cut the worst one left in your list. Those are the major trends, and what that means is when we see a card that hasn't decreased in play but has actually increased in play proportionally since the time it was released, usually that's a sign that something special is going on. So maybe as another example, we can talk about DMU. Leyline Binding was the most improved card from this set. I think a lot of people prior to the set's release didn't necessarily expect, what looks like a 6 mana O-ring to see constructed success, much less the amount of success that it's seen. I think it was a formative card in many constructed formats. And that's the kind of thing that, number one, it builds your players' familiarity with the card so that if you test it, people aren't like, what is this? I've never read this. I'm not reading this. Instead, they're like, oh, I've seen, LSV or Reed Duke or someone play this on Twitch or YouTube, and I know how it works. I know how to support it with the rest of my draft. So I think that's one reason why a card might see more play. And then also, it's just pretty fun. So that helps a lot too.
Yeah, that one to me, I think, is definitely just inherited, constructed bias almost. I'm not even convinced that card is actually that great in a lot of cubes, but, it did because of largely triomes and fetch lands. I think it's still a major player in Modern, and it was for a while a major player in Legacy. I think the meta is kind of shifting right now, and maybe it's not in the best spot in terms of what it can answer and what it costs. But Yeah, I think that's a great example of just constructed influencing people's cube designs in ways that when they first looked at the set, they overlooked it. And it's not like if that card had never taken off and constructed, cube designers would have found it anyway. They would have just continued overlooking it, you know?
Actually, I bet what happened is that almost a year after Leyline Binding came out, Up the Beanstalk came out, and there's a really powerful synergy there in Eternal formats.
There sure is.
I think Beans is now banned in a bunch of formats, although I'm not totally keeping up with it. So that's maybe one additional, who would test Leyline Binding because Beans wasn't out yet, and so nobody knew to look for Leyline Binding as a uniquely powerful effect. Just really interesting how these things kind of evolve. And there's far too many results for us to go through all of them individually like that, but that's the kind of dynamic that you'll see repeated over and over throughout this results table.
Was there anything that really jumped out at you and just surprised you about these sort of high-level results, Parker?
So something I like to do is see how many survivors are left from each set. That's kind of my coinage to refer to cards that have stuck around even past the set's rotation from standard in cubes. So, for example, Dominaria United had a median of 7 survivors. So that means the median cube that responded to our surveys is still playing 7 Dominaria United cards at the median.
Which is quite a few.
Quite a few out of a 360 card cube, that's a 5 card cycle and 2 extras or whatever. That's almost a full cycle of dual lands, just to think about the proportions there. So that's a lot. And then the second most enduring set from this time period was the Brothers' War with 6. And you may have noticed that was the first set in this time period, followed by the second set in this time period.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, are these sets going to keep getting less and less popular with time? And indeed they do.
This is a little bit of the elephant in the room. I do think that this period of Magic sets covers an interesting part of the changing sort of texture of Magic design. And I think a lot of cube designers changing attitudes towards how they engage with new product.
Mm-hmm. By the time we get to Phyrexia, all will be one. Only 3 cards survived in the Armenian Respondents Cube, which is less than, over the same time period, a set like Strixhaven or Kaldheim from several years ago. And I don't think of Strixhaven as a particularly awesome cube set.
Certainly not.
It's not powerful 5 years later or whatever. And yet, over the same time period, people were still playing more Strixhaven cards than All Will Be One cards. And so to me, I don't know. I think that there might be several things going on. Something that I noticed in my own cube is that I was having harder and harder time finding room for the set's main mechanics in my Eternal list. Maybe Dominaria United is a good example of this. The main mechanics of that set were Kicker, Domain, Enlist, which is like a combat evasion keyword. Was there anything else?
Oh, you're quizzing me off the top of my head. I'm going to fail to do this. This is not a good thing for me. I'm not good at this.
No, it's all right. I think Multicolor Kicker and Domain were the main mechanics of the set, right? Mm-hmm. These are mechanics that have been around since Invasion Block, roughly. And so players are super, super familiar with them. Prototype from Brothers' War, less so. Toxic from All Will Be One, even less so, right? And so it's not that any one mechanic is complex on its own. It's just that this starts to add up. And when you have to add that to the complexity of those kind of quasi-evergreen keywords like Kicker and Domain, for me, I found the juice to be less and less worth the squeeze. And I wonder if other people are thinking that as well.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I think the thing that is most shocking to me looking at these results in the aggregate, maybe shocking is the wrong word, but the thing that surprises me a little bit is that I feel like we live in a little bit of a bubble on this show where we are often talking about cube design on the fringe, outside of sort of the assumed sort of power-motivated, legacy or vintage lists. And I feel like more and more, there's a lot of people that are working in that space. And what I'm seeing in a lot of these results is actually kind of just a reminder that most people are still not doing that. Most cubes are still just power motivated. So, for example, from Dominaria United, the most played card on Cube Cobra right now is Shoulder the Apocalypse, which is a card that is perfectly at home in power motivated lists, but really miserable in any environment that is not really at the peaks of power. And I found to be too unfun in many ways, even for my most powerful cube. And then like Unfinity, like Comet Stellar Pup being played quite a bit is notable, though I'm not sure how much that actually is at the end of the day. I mean, it's the most popular card, but probably among a set without that many popular cards.
Yeah, it was a very small response.
Yeah, Torsten, founder of Benalia, being the most popular card from Dominar United Commander. It's just like, all right, that's a reanimation target. You have to be playing like Reanimator for that to like make sense. And just that we're in a world where more people think Shoulder It is right for their cube than Cut Down, right, which is such a clean, elegant removal spell, is telling to me that like we are still very much living in the world of power motivated cubes being the default among most cube designers.
Yeah, that could be true. Another explanation I pose in the article for the decreased enthusiasm with each set in this time period could just be the pace of release. Again, 14 sets came out over this time period. The last rotation, there were only like 8 sets in the same time period. So somehow you've crammed in 5 or 6 more releases. And so, of course, by the time you get to Lord of the Rings and Lord of the Rings has a bunch of modern playable cards, it's like, well, I got to find room for this Orcish Bowmasters, so I'm going to cut this Cult Conscripts that I haven't even gotten to test properly just because it's a known quantity or whatever. So that could be another explanation for what's going on here, or, just something that maybe I haven't thought of. But it's really interesting to note that every set in this time period is less popular than the one before it. With the exception of Lord of the Rings, it was a little bit of a blip, and that makes sense, right? Lord of the Rings, iconic property. It's a modern power level set. So it, I think, is expected to have a few more survivors than the other sets in this time period.
I also just think that Lord of the Rings clearly had like some of the best and brightest in the R&D team working on it, and a lot of resources in the design and development because it was so high stakes for WotC and for Hasbro. So I think the cards are genuinely great from that set too, power level and IP aside.
Even then, in our survey respondents, Lord of the Rings is only about as durable as Strixhaven and Kaldheim, and less enduring than Dominaria United from the same time period.
Dominaria United is kind of great, honestly. Like hindsight 2020, Dominaria United was a 6 set.
It was a banger set. So yeah, those are kind of the macro trends.
I would highly recommend everybody go check out your article, Parker. It is very thorough. It includes all the statistics as well as a lot of helpful contextualization, editorializing by Parker to sort of help understand them. It is a really interesting way to just, survey a relatively recent history of Magic sets and what they mean for cube design. I think on this episode, though, Parker, we should talk more sort of from our own personal experience and just about the cards that maybe we overrated, underrated, or just really love a lot from this particular era.
Sure. I have, for my own part, 5 lessons that I learned from looking at my results from this time period, and 5 successes that I had over this time period. Maybe we should start with the lessons.
Yeah, I have, for me, 4 cards that I underrated and now really, really love. 1 card that I overrated, notably, and want to talk about, and then just 3 other cards that are favorites from this set that maybe I rated accurately, but just want to note are some of my favorite cards to play in multiple cubes from this particular block. So that's what I've got. Let's start with your lessons.
Okay. My first lesson was to stop testing cards that nobody knows. I think when March of the Machine Commander came out, I tested several of the 3-color legends. One of them, Slimefoot and Squee. Have you ever heard of this card?
I have heard of Slimefoot and Squee.
Text at all?
I could not tell you the rules text. I know that it's Jund. I can start you there, but that's basically all I got for you.
It is Jund. It does stuff, but that's not really important because nobody knows what it does. Same with Goro Goro and Satoru from the same set. I was testing these cards because they were cool and they appealed on power level, but then I realized, wait, nobody knows these, so they just won't get picked and they won't get main decked to the same extent.
Especially 3-color cards, those have to, I think, clear a pretty high bar for excitement from a player. And if that high bar includes them having to read it for the first time and process it in the time they have to make 1 pick from a pack, I think you're pretty likely to have a card be overlooked.
And that's even considering that my Eternal Cube Theseus is somewhat tailor-made to play 3-color decks fairly easily. Even then, they're less appealing. And I learned that those cards really have to clear a much higher bar. A card like Lelia, which was initially released in a Commander product, you could say maybe that power level's too high or the play patterns are undesirable. But at this point, enough people know what she does that I think it's cleared that bar for just recognizability, right? And the same can't be said for a card that has just been released. So That's one lesson for me, is that I needed to attenuate my ratings for cards that are less likely to see play and like gain recognizability.
That's a lesson I think a lot of new cube designers might think sounds weird. They're like, what do you mean you can't trust your players to read the cards in your cube? That you have to expect them to know every single card? And not fully. Like, I think a lot of cards can be shortcut or like clearly read as like, oh, this is a variation on a removal spell. I don't have to have seen this card before to like know how to evaluate it in a pack. There's some certain card types that there's more leeway among your drafters in sort of asking them to do some comprehension and reading in a pack. But in general, I do think more cube designers should think about playing cards that are going to be known to their playgroup. And that is a, meta-contextual decision. It depends on what your playgroup knows and is excited about. Mm-hmm. What's your second lesson, Parker?
My second lesson, and these are kind of like in ascending order of how painful it was, was the Brothers' War. Do you want to guess the top most improved card from this time period?
I'm going to not look at it in the article.
Anthony would guess it in a second.
It's a Scrapwork Mutt.
It is Scrapwork Mutt. Okay. Ding, ding, ding.
There you go.
Yeah. This card I love. I didn't initially test it in my kind of medium power cube Pulp Nouveau, but it turns out to be perfect for that environment. This is a 2 generic mana for a 2/1 artifact creature dog. When it enters, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card, and it unearths from your graveyard for 1 and a red. I really love cards like this that their text box suggests several axes of synergy. So with Scrapwork Mutt, you might put it in a Madness deck or just a graveyard deck more generically. And it helps you put stuff in your graveyard, and it also doesn't mind itself being put in your graveyard. It also boosts artifact decks, or like, if card draw matters in your cube. And so it's got all of these axes of synergy. And so you might pick it for those reasons as an enabler and main deck it for the same reason. But then once you actually start playing the game, I love that this is 2 generic mana and it filters your draw. And so sometimes you'll like ignore the synergy and just be like, I need to fix this color screw that's going on with my opening hand. And so I'm going to play it for a totally different reason than I thought I was putting it in my deck for. And now I'm like engaging with the risk reward of Magic's mana base.
Yeah, I think Scrapwork Mutt is a real triumph of a card, because I think cube designers are often kind of in love with these cards that they see as like bridging multiple synergies or archetypes. And I find as a player that very often I can see what the cube designer is thinking, but in reality, this card just isn't good enough at any of those things for anyone to want to main deck it. It's like, cool, I understand that this is like has 2 different words on it that each connect them to 2 different color pairs, but it's not actually good enough for either of these things to be playable, and that is not the case with Scrapwork Mutt. This card is pretty strong on rate in a lot of contexts. I mean, even the most powerful cubes, like a 2-mana discard outlet, is fine. A 2-mana discard outlet that you can then discard itself and then still have a discard outlet sitting in your graveyard for use later, and all the sort of cheap artifact stuff going on, like, it hangs. And so I think most cube designers will find that if they put this in their cube thinking it will be a bridge card, it actually will. It'll be played by a lot of different decks for a lot of different reasons, and just ends up making everything sort of run a little smoother and doing what people want those bridge cards to do that I think they often fail to do.
Yep. I love, again, how it just like taps into a particular kind of mana base. For example, you could play it in a base, black-green deck that happens to have 1 red fetch and 1 red typed duel or whatever. And you plan to play it as a generic card with generic costs, that is. And if you happen to draw just naturally your red source, then you'll have a little bit of extra play, but it doesn't commit you fully to a 3rd splash, right? Like that's right. The gentlest possible, or you might do it off of a Birds of Paradise or whatever, an Ignoble Hierarch. And so unlocking those like little moments of, oh, I didn't know I could even do this in my deck, but it just so happens I have this treasure token lying around. And so now I get to unlock this cool moment.
So what was the lesson here? Remind me. I mean, Scrapwork Mutt, cool.
Well,
agreed.
I missed it. I did not test it in Pulp Nouveau.
I see. Okay.
When the set came out, just totally missed it.
Well, you weren't listening to Anthony. He said very clearly it was great and everyone should be playing it. So that's on you for not listening to our good man.
At the time I was just beginning design work on Pulp Nouveau, so I don't know what was going through my head at the time. But now that cube is a little more mature, it's certainly an oversight.
All right. What's lesson number 3?
Lesson number 3 is Misery's Shadow, which I also missed. This one for my higher power Eternal Cube. Now, Misery's Shadow is...
Yeah, Misery Shadow is just 1 and a black for a 2/2, and it has, you can pay 1 to pump it by +1/+1, 1 generic, and whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, it is instead exiled, right? Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's right.
This is one of the cards I also overlooked, Parker.
Yeah, it's sneaky powerful, right?
It is.
I think sometimes in the world of post-Modern Horizons Eternal Magic, it's like, why would I want a mana sink? Like this shade ability that looks like Nantuko Shade or something. Surely that's outmoded in 2025. And I think the fact is, we're still playing limited Magic. Sometimes you're going to flood out. 17 lands in a 40-card deck is still more than most modern decks play. And so it comes with more risk of mana flood, and it comes with some games that are a little bit looser than you might have in Constructed. Even in the powerful cubes, right? Even in the cubes that are cutting their curve and trimming down and down and down with more and more powerful cheap cards. So I love that part of it. I also think it's the right kind of graveyard hate for my goals, where it's not just locking out the player who's trying to delve their graveyard or turn on Delirium necessarily. It does allow some amount of graveyard hate, but it only exiles things from the battlefield that die or that would die. And so that means that there's a little bit of play with your opponent, right? They don't get their Bloodghast immediately exiled with no chance to play with their card. They get to do the thing once, and then once it dies from the battlefield, they won't get to do Bloodghast ad infinitum. So that kind of yes, it's backstopping against the worst excesses of the graveyard, but it won't hate those people out by accident. That's kind of the sweet spot for me.
I think it does have some accidental knock-on effects, but yeah, to echo what you said about this card, it has massively overperformed my expectations. This is the kind of card where I didn't fully overlook it. I included it in my survey. I rated it a 1, though. I was like, maybe there's something here, but I really, really doubt it. And it turns out there's a lot there. And it's the card that as soon as it's the battlefield, you're like, oh, this is actually a huge problem. This is a card I must remove and also will struggle to remove with toughness-based removal if my opponent plays around it and leaves some mana up. Yeah, it's the complete package, right? If you are in any kind of stall, it will block almost anything in almost any environment. It will attack and threaten to kill almost anything that blocks it. So you can just, attack with impunity with that threat of activation. And then I do think that sort of hate-berry, grave hate effect on it matters a lot depending on context, right? Like in my cube, for example, turning off all the Titans is huge. Getting Uro and Croxa and Flage, not to come back is a really big deal. It ends up coming up quite a bit, and I think this sort of combination of a powerful but sort of resource-intensive threat and also a pretty good hate bear ability is exactly what I want out of a 2-drop, especially in black in my cube.
Actually, while we're here, if Misery Shadow is a complete silver bullet against your deck, unlike something like Scrabbling Claws or, I don't know, Rest in Peace, it's actually pretty easy to deal with.
Yeah, you just kill it.
You can just block it for 1 if they happen to be tapped out, or you can just use a normal creature removal spell on it. So again, that's another axis of counterplay to the counterplay, which really creates dynamic games where it doesn't have the same value in every game. Sometimes it's your ace, sometimes it's your jack or whatever.
Yeah. I guess what I'm saying is I often find that this is a 2-drop that must be removed, and more often than I expected. I like that sort of texture. I like my 2-drops to be powerful enough that they demand some sort of answer.
Gives me warm, fuzzy feelings. Okay, my number 2 miss, or I guess my 4th lesson, was that I rated Jor Kadeen First Gold Warden a 10,
Whoa.
Saying, I think this will be a staple for years to come.
Whoa.
I know. It's a red and white for a 2/2 trample, and then whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+X for the number of equipped creatures you control, and if its power is 4 or greater, then you draw a card.
Explain yourself, Parker. Explain yourself.
Well, I'm a sucker for kind of Watch Wolf style effects, and this is certainly in that mold, right? 2/2 trample is slightly above rate for what you might expect, or what I expected back in 2023 at least, and also promises to draw a card and start snowballing a little bit. And so I was excited about it. But then 2 things happened. One is the stat line for 2-mana creatures started really increasing. I mean, this set also had Cankerbloom in it, which is just a 2-mana 3/2 in green with upside. And I don't know, maybe that makes me sound like a stats boomer, but what I'm saying is that a 2/2 trample did kind of suffer from stats inflation even over this time period. I mean, by the time we get to Lord of the Rings or whatever. And then the second thing that happened is that the pace of releases meant that I didn't really get to test this as much as I would want to. By the time I would have gotten enough testing, another card would have come out that I would like even more. I lost enthusiasm for it in a way that I was not expecting.
Yeah, this card definitely does not read to me as a 10, but maybe that's the benefit of hindsight for me. It seems, kind of narrow, and I think you do really want to be doing the equipment thing for this card to matter, even in a lower powered environment, right? Like, yeah, 2/2 trample is maybe very slightly overrate, but, a 2/2 trample for 2 in like a retail limited set would be, I imagine, a C minus maybe in like even just regular retail limited.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
It does draw the cards even if it's got a Rancor attached or if it's got 2 +1/+1 counters on it. It doesn't have to be an equipment that's pushing its power over 4. That was my initial copium of like how I talked myself into this.
So you were like kind of maybe even not reading that equip creatures thing and just being like, oh, if I just pump this to 4 power, it becomes a card draw engine that, has trample.
Yeah. But that also illustrates like some fallout from this pace of release of like none of my drafters would have been able to parse that and like interpret that this wasn't in fact an equipment card. It was an Aura's card or just a stat monster. You're supposed to ignore the equipment line.
I'll take this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite cards from this cycle, or this set rather, not set. I mean, this era, sure. This time period, which is Baird Argivian Recruiter, which I think is a card that ostensibly cares about so many similar things, right? Like it's like, yeah, just make my power bigger, make anything else's power bigger, and I'll give you some reward for it. But that's a card that I adore and has been one of my favorite cards in my Sacred Geometry cube. It's just perfect, easy to understand payoff for a wide variety of things. +1/+1 counters, creatures with pump abilities like your Misery Shadow, combat tricks of any kind, equipment of any kind, auras of any kind. It just pays off so many things and does so in a way that is very elegant that that to me, compared to a card like this, is like that's kind of touching on a similar themes, but I think in a way that is much more flexible and resonant than Jorkadine.
I also love Baird. At the time, I only rated it a 6.8. And so these are like a little bit entwined, right? By the time I figured out that I actually loved Baird, like I thought Jorkadine might replace Baird, I think, at the time. But then I figured out, I actually love Baird, and I don't feel the same way about Jorkadine. And so, again, that was kind of a symptom of the pace of release here.
For sure.
Because now I'm still playing Baird, but I'm not playing Jorkadine.
Yeah, I didn't have the cube that I play Baird in at the time, but I like to think I would have rated it quite highly for Sacred Geometry.
It's a lovely card. That's maybe the card from this time period that I would blanket recommend to anybody. It and Scrapwork Mutt. If you haven't tested those two or read them yet, just give it a look.
We've touched on 2 of my 3 favorites from this period, Baird and Scrapwork Mutt. They're both so great.
Really good. Okay, my number 1 lesson. You ready for it?
I'm ready. I've been waiting with bated breath.
My number 1 lesson is battles from March of the Machine. Do you remember, we spent a long time talking about battles during our survey episode.
I trust you. I don't remember it at all. Did I say that I didn't like them and would never play any of them? Because that's how I feel right now.
I don't know. I just remember defending them a little bit. And I somewhat stand by that defense, but I tested 13 battles in my Eternal Cube Theseus. And the reason I tested so many is I was like, if I'm going to miss, I'd like to miss big, right? I want to swing.
Yeah, find out.
Like, give this a legitimate swing. And if I don't like the battles, I will know for certain that it wasn't because I just didn't play enough, right? Yeah. I'm going to make sure that they show up in enough games. I'm going to make sure that my players are forced to like encounter them and like, learn how to play with them a little bit in an Eternal Cube. That's why I went for 13 and not just like the one that looked most powerful.
Which I think is defensible. I mean, that is, I think, what cube designers should be doing. And honestly, I'm curious to hear you talk more about this, but I don't see this as like a lesson that needs to be learned in the sense that like this was a mistake. It's like you did a thing and you committed to a bit to see how you felt about it, and you learned how you felt about it and adjusted accordingly.
Well, here's the thing. I had it in for 1 draft, I think.
Oh,
maybe 2.
Okay.
And then the Lord of the Rings spoilers started, and they debuted a mechanic, the Ring Tempts You, which has a lot of rules text, so I'm not going to read it. It'll be in our cards mentioned page, I guess. But the Ring Tempts You was almost identical to battles in the sense of complexity. Like, obviously, they don't play it all the same, but both of them were mechanics that I wasn't really comfortable testing one of if I wasn't testing 10 more examples of that. Both of them create this like mini game and totally reshape kind of the texture of Magic. Battles with a whole new card type And then the ring tempts you with this like mini game of kind of leveling up your ring bearer. And what I realized is that they're just going to keep printing these. Like,
they're not going to stop.
Battles is not a unique experiment. I could repeat that experiment for the Ring Tempts You, and then I could have done the same thing in the set after that, Wilds of Eldraine. I could have done that with Rolls, and then I could have done that in Lost Caverns of Ixalan with Craft, right? These backbone mechanics that are hugely important in their respective card files. You know, there's like, again, 30 battles in March of the Machine. It was a big part of that limited format. And it made the limited format fun and unique, but then they did something equally fun and unique that's not mutually compatible in a cube.
At least not for the complexity budget you're allotting yourself.
Right. I could have played just the most powerful battle and just the one most powerful Ring Tempts You. But then I've got two mini games that don't always play well together or take up, bandwidth in my drafters' minds. And that's just not something I was willing to live with. And so it wasn't a failed experiment because I tested the battles and learned that they didn't fit my goals or they weren't as powerful as I wanted. It was a failed experiment because I realized there wasn't a point to it.
Sure.
If I want to do that, it needs to be its own cube. And this is a cube that I want to be more recognizable and more kind of evergreen, I guess.
Yeah, that is, I think, a nice summary of the sort of trend of Magic card design over the past 3 years and sort of across this time period where, they're running out of space for like elegant, simple, easy to parse mechanics that can be the backbones of whole sets and giving themselves a little more leeway to add some complexity there as long as it is sort of, resonant and cohesive within a given set. But I do think for us cube designers, it's much harder to put one battle in your cube or, one card with craft in your cube or whatever, or one card with a roll in your cube because the inherent sort of baked in complexity is so much more than we're used to. All right. I want to talk about some more of my underrated cards. I have 4 here in ascending order of how much I underrated them. The first one is actually Dreams of Steel and Oil. This is the 1-mana black discard spell that can take an artifact or a creature. But then, very importantly, and something I kind of overlooked at first, you can also exile that card and another card from your opponent's graveyard. And I overlooked this because my sort of rule of thumb for hand hate for discard cards is that like Duress is great because black decks have very little, if any, ways to deal with a non-creature permanent that resolves. If your opponent sticks a Planeswalker, I guess actually the worst example. Planeswalkers, they actually can't answer. If they stick an artifact or an enchantment or, resolve a big instant or sorcery, you have nothing you can say about it for the most part in black. And so Duress is your one way to prevent, that thing from happening in the first place. Whereas a creature spell that, Dreams of Steel and Oil can take, you can just use a kill spell on. And in my cube, in most cubes, black has a ton of kill spells. And so I sort of was like, I don't need this. This is like another sort of Duress that can't hit non-creatures. It can only hit creatures and artifacts. And I don't have an artifact theme in this cube. There's actually not that many artifacts at all. So I was just like, this is not for me. It's kind of a miss in terms of hand hate effects. And what I ended up coming back to this card for was that exile effect. The fact that it exiles the card and also can take another card out of their graveyard means that it does another whole thing, which is like be a grave hate effect. And grave hate in combination with some amount of, disruption in the form of hand hate, even if it is nowhere near as potent as the disruption that is afforded by a Duress or an Inquisition of Kozilek or a Thoughtseize. Those things combined very much makes this a worthwhile card, at the very least as a great sideboard card in my cube. You always bring in Dreams of Steel and Oil as soon as you've seen, for example, one of the aforementioned Titans. This is great against your Uros and your Phlasias, and those are some of the cards that are the most defining and most sort of essential to the power level of my Bun Magic cube. And so I eventually came back to this card long after its release because of that exile effect. And I think it is actually quite good as a sort of flexible answer to a lot of different things.
It helps that Dreams in Steel and Oil has a really kind of unique and beautiful art piece by Jeremy Wilson. And that's actually something I've really loved about this time period is kind of an increased amount of expressionism and like abstraction in the art. I mean, I see Mishra's face or whatever in this art and a Phyrexian symbol, but the rest is pretty abstract, and I think that kind of rules.
Yeah, so Mystery Shadow, which we talked about, then Dreams of Steel and Oil was my my third most underrated card. My second most underrated card, in hindsight, I don't know why I didn't think this was good enough, because it's exactly my kind of card, is Electrostatic Infantry. This is a card I have played in a number of my cubes. 2 mana for a 1/2 with Trample in red. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Just a great, kind of snowballing spells matter payoff that is very clean. The Trample is obviously essential here. It's sort of most comparable, I think, to Sprite Dragon, but in just red, obviously, instead of having to be in red-blue. And the extra point of toughness, I do think actually kind of matters. Like, I think maybe my initial read of this was like, oh, this is just a much worse Sprite Dragon, and, it's effectively kind of already a blue-red card anyway, so who cares that it only costs red mana? But in practice, I have found that it is, maybe just as good, that extra toughness being sort of really relevant in my cube where I have lots of toughness matters removal. And also, I do see this played in red-black decks, where you've got Dreadhorde Arcanist and a bunch of discard spells and removal spells you're flashing back with it, and those are all triggering your Electrostatic Infantry. You don't have to be in blue for this to work, and it's just been a card that I think scales very elegantly with the power level across a number of my different cubes.
Yeah, it's a cool card and surprisingly powerful. I find that, with even 2 counters on it, it becomes must answer in a way that's surprising.
3/4 Trample is a really strong stat line.
And it then trades pretty cleanly with removal too. Go ahead, spend your Doomblade on this. I didn't spend more mana on this than you spent removing it, and so I'm still happy, relatively.
Yeah, it's in the same category for me as Misery's Shadow of this will become a 2-drop you must remove more often than maybe you think. And anytime you are forced to use that, hard removal spell on a 2-drop, I am pretty happy. That's my goals for this cube. My number one most underrated card, and I think a lot of cube designers will have to cop to this and join me in this, was Lorien Revealed, which is the island cycling card from the cycle of 1 mana typed land cyclers from Lord of the Rings, or you can just cast it for 5 mana on its front face as a sorcery to draw 3. And this card is probably the card I am least likely to cut from my Bun Magic cube from this entire block, and it was a card I did not even test at first. And I'll admit part of that was a little bit of burnout. I did not do the deepest dive in the Lord of the Rings set as I maybe should have. But also we can just see that from the results of the survey, it was really massively underrated and then went on to prove to be also a constructed all-star. And I just adore this card. I basically run it as a land. You can basically count it as a land. It's basically a tap land that goes and gets whatever island you need to get. And then having more sort of just dumb, simple card draw in your deck is something I've come to really appreciate about the texture of control decks I want. I think a lot of more contemporary control decks don't have just, big card draw spells. Instead, they have planeswalkers, or they have, other ways to sort of gain virtual card advantage or sort of accumulate things slowly, but they don't just have simple, I play a lot of removal spells and counter spells and card draw, and I will eventually, grind you out through card advantage. But that's the texture of control that I really like, and this is such a great way to get another big card draw spell in your deck at an extremely, extremely low opportunity cost. Plus, then on top of it, you have the fact that you can go get your cycling lands later in the game. You can go get your irrigated farmland with this, and then cycle that. So you can just turn this into drawing 2 if you, for example, don't want to tap out at sorcery speed to draw 3, but you already have enough lands, so you can hold up counter magic and then just keep cycling through your deck. Otherwise, it does everything. It also goes and gets Mystic Sanctuary in my cube, which is a card that I have a lot of consideration for. The fact that it's island cycling to go get that is key. It's a perfect card for me, perfect modal card, and my only regret is that it's in the, I think, abominable Universes Beyond frame, and I think the proper noun name means we are very unlikely to get a Universes Within printing of this anytime soon. But yeah, that's my favorite card from this era, and it's not close.
In fact, Lorien Revealed is the number 1 most improved card from this entire time period.
I am not alone.
For all sets. Yeah. It's certainly, extremely powerful. I'm certain that its cube visibility was boosted by people like Bosch and Roll or, Reed Duke playing this in Legacy and Modern. That certainly doesn't hurt. And then actually all 5 land cyclers from Lord of the Rings, including Troll of Khazad Doom, Oliphant, Generous Int. Somewhere there's an Eagle that's not quite as popular as the other 4, but also increased in play. All 5 of these turned out to be really powerful.
1 mana typed land cycling is great.
And we haven't seen 1 mana typed land cycling. I mean, there's Ash Barrens, but it's
but that's not typed. That's basic lands.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Now I desperately want an Ash Barrens that has Plane Cycling, Island Cycling, Swamp Cycling. I mean, it would be ugly to write, but but that's what I want Ash Barons to be for sure. Yeah, we have not seen this before or since, and these cards have also caused quite a bit of trouble in Constructed, and so I kind of think we maybe won't see this again for quite a long time.
Is Troll banned in Legacy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. It was a huge problem. And there was speculation when they were banning it. I listened to Eternal Glory, which is a Eternal Constructed podcast, and they were suggesting that more cuts were necessary because it was entirely possible that deck would still be great because it would just move on to the next 1-mana land cycler. And if you ban that one, it would just go to the next 1-mana land cycler and just keep being viable. That turned out to not be the case, but that was at least a suspicion people had. So I kind of don't think we'll see this again anytime soon, but if you are playing typed dual lands, especially typed dual lands with other abilities, I mean, this is great with Surveil lands. It's so good if you have, non-basic islands in your cube, and I think a perfect card.
I find the creature land cyclers to be a little bit self-solving. Like, I've played a Reanimate in a black deck just for my troll and value Reanimate. I think it's a little cheap that, my otherwise fair mid-range deck occasionally gets a turn 2 6/5.
6/5 unblockable, basically.
Right. And it can be fun in a vintage cube, and that was the format where I was encountering this play pattern. But I also am a little cheap that we're getting people to play 5 and 6 mana cards by virtue of giving them this awesome buyout clause where most of the time they just get discarded and turned into a land. I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't played with those cards enough to say, but I will say in my neoclassical cube, I play a couple of big threats with cycling that are meant to be reanimation targets, things like Scion of Darkness and Eternal Dragon. And I really like those play patterns there. And really the only thing that's different about that compared to these cards is the efficiency. And, those cards are costed for old school Magic, and these cards are like the equivalent for, contemporary Magic. And I don't know, I think it's possible for that to be kind of interesting and cool in the right sort of context.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think
agree.
That's just, to each their own. I think it's way cooler to reanimate an Eternal Dragon than to reanimate a Troll of Khazad Doom, but that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, you have to mean it with Scion of Darkness. Sometimes you're going to be color or mana screwed, and you can't actually afford the cycling cost.
Because it's 3.
I know, it's crazy.
And they're just regular cycling. Well, the Eternal Dragon has plane cycling, but there's way less good typed planes. Anyway, I think that sort of play pattern is not inherently necessarily toxic, but the sort of magnitude of that power peak when you do get to do the turn 2 Troll of Khazad Doom is maybe a little bit beyond the pale for most people's fair cubes. I mean, maybe another way to put this is I run a value reanimate in the Bun Magic cube and therefore include no other sort of reanimation threats and, don't have reanimator deck. So I...
Troll is off limits, huh?
Yeah, Troll is off limits. I can't put Troll in because that's what people will do with it, and that is unfair. So you don't get to. I can't play Troll. Otherwise, I would, for sure. And I thought about cutting Reanimate for Troll, and people have asked me to do that, but Reanimate's just too iconic for me. I love that card too much. All right, in terms of overrated cards, first, I want to just give myself a little pat on the back. And I think if you listen to previous of these episodes in this series where we do other standard retrospectives, you will hear me say something to the effect of, boy, I really just overestimated the cards that I was liking and how much I would actually like them long term. And I think the DMU is right around when I started maybe readjusting and responding to that sort of loop of self-feedback of being like, actually, I tend to really overrate things in card surveys and in new set surveys. And so actually, if I look back, through all of these sets in my sort of set survey results, there are very few sets where, aside from the things I've mentioned already, only giving Misery Shadow a 1 and overlooking Lord and Reveal, Dreams of Steel, and Oil Electrostatic Infantry, I'm not being super optimistic about cards. I'm not overrating a lot of things. The one that I will sort of note that I gave a quite high rating and am no longer playing, though I did play for a long time, is Evolved Sleeper, which is one of those sort of level up cards. This particular one, on the last level, you can draw cards and lose life as you sort of keep ticking it up. And this card just ended up being a little too complicated for me, and I felt like I do like having a certain number of level up cards in my cube, and this one, compared to some of the more iconic precedent, the iconic cards people maybe know a little more and know a little better, just proved to not be worth the space for me. So yeah, I think it was a complexity cut at the end of the day, and I liked a lot of things about it, but people maybe weren't reading the whole thing or kind of shortcutting it, and I just kept seeing it going around later than I thought it should, and ended up eventually giving it the cut. So that is the highest rated card for me that I am not still playing from this era. Not even that bad of an oversight, to be honest. I overrated it, but not dramatically, I would say.
I also cut Evolved Sleeper. That one, I cut because of the death touch counter, which was the only ability counter in Theseus. You said something a couple weeks ago about, I think, Neoclassical Cube, where you're like, one card is the wrong number of effects of this kind to run. I feel the same way about ability counters, where it's like, if I'm running 10 of them, then fine. The kind of the mechanical edge cases of having an ability counter versus being granted an ability, those will be somewhat expected. But with just one instance, every time the ability counter matters, it's going to feel weird and exceptional and unexpected.
Yeah.
So that's why I cut it.
Yeah, I hate that detail too. And I think in my cube, I'm pretty sure there's nothing that cares about the fact that it's specifically a counter. Like, one of the reasons those are annoying is like, sometimes it can matter if you have various counters matters things, or if you have modified creatures matter or stuff like that. I'm pretty sure in the Bun Magic Cube, you could safely play it as just like, against Death Touch, right? Which simplified it a little bit, but certainly don't like people having to read the words Death Touch counter on a card in my cube.
That was your only major overrated?
I would say so. I mean, there were a couple other cards that were like kind of high up there. Like, I was a little excited about Flame of Aenor, and ultimately not on that anymore because it's a little bit finicky and also has Universes Beyond going on. Really, very few things I rated, let's say, over like a 5 or 6 that I am not still playing from this entire era, which I'm a little surprised by, to be honest. I think you've heard me talk on the past about how I should get better about doing this, and I think I did, actually, and I'm surprised that I did. I'm surprised I responded to trends and actually adjusted my behavior.
Yeah, that's cool.
Just in terms of favorite cards from this era, Scrapwork Baird, we've already mentioned. Those were cards that I estimated accurately in my survey. One other card that I love from this era that we haven't talked about yet, that was not overrated or underrated, I think I knew from the start that I would love it, and I do in fact, is Glimmerlens. Glimmerlens is definitely my favorite equipment from this particular block. This is the 2-mana equipment that comes into play. It makes a 2/2, it attaches itself to it, and when you attack with 2 or more creatures, one of them being equipped with the Glimmerlens, I think it has to be equipped with the Glimmerlens. Yeah, when this creature, and at least one other creature attack, you get to draw a card, and I think this was like the absolute final nail in the coffin for me ever including anything that resembles sort of a like mana cheating equipment in my Stoneforge Mystic package, because this, along with things like Lion Sash and just other sort of value equipment, fills out a beautiful little equipment package so nicely that you can turn Stoneforge Mystic into a great value card, a great sort of toolbox without having to sort of rely on it as a sort of combo piece. And I do, in general, really like giving aggressive decks a way to generate card advantage. And this particular one I have found very often, you are willing to attack and trade in combat in exchange for drawing cards, right? Like, it's not like you have perfect attacks, but Glimmerlens will make it so your attacks that you otherwise wouldn't make, you will make, because if you do attack with 2 creatures, you get to draw a card and cash in that 1 drop that is no longer doing much on the board that now maybe can, trade with the blocker or even just get eaten for a new card. And I think that sort of texture is really awesome. I'll say that even though this card has one substantial downside to me, which is the presence of a 2/2 red rebel creature token that a white card makes, hate everything about that. This is the only 4 Mirrodin card I run. But even with that downside, this is a card I cannot imagine cutting anytime soon because of the way that it impacts the draft and the sort of archetypes in my cube. And then more importantly, the way that it impacts the games once it's actually in play, in that it really encourages attacks and offers a lot of interesting decisions of, am I willing to trade this off for a card? And you can also bluff with this card a lot. Your opponent thinks you're actually trading this card off, but you actually have a trick. And if you had attacked without the sort of onboard obvious benefit of the Glimmerlens, they would have seen that sort of trick, but they don't see that anymore because there's an obvious reason to attack on board. Just, it leads to so many cool decisions and play patterns. It's a card I really recommend. I will say it is really only appropriate at, I think, quite high power levels. So if you're playing like a regular cube style cube, this is probably going to be way too good. But if you are playing powerful Magic, this is a great consideration, I think.
It's really fun. And worth noting that it is the second most improved card from the Commander releases of this time period. Only behind Staff of the Storyteller, which is actually from the same set and does, kind of a similar thing in the fact that it makes tokens and draws cards.
Staff is a card a lot of people really love. I've played it in a couple other cubes and never really gotten around to playing it in my own. Just, I don't know. It doesn't feel quite right to me. It feels so dirtily. It's not an
equipment, which feels so weird.
It just feels so dirtily. Like, I'm a player that I love Retrofitter Foundry. I love Glimmerlens that we just talked about. I don't think Staff of the Storyteller does it for me. But there's a lot of people that love that card, so that's another one to check out if you're unfamiliar.
I want to talk about maybe my biggest success of this time period, which is related to your success of rating cards more lowly. I noticed during this time period, I took a lot of L's. I was telling you this before the recording, where like most of the cards I tested, I am not still playing, and I don't think it was a good idea to, like, a lot of failed experiments. But I realized that's actually maybe a false impression, because I wasn't testing a lot of cards that had previously tripped me up.
We love to see a growth. Parker doing a growth.
Yeah. I'm referring to the Jackal Pups and the Doom Blades. Most of the sets in this time period, and in fact, most of the sets over the course of our entire Perspective survey series, the uncommon Doom Blade from the set, often a high performer. We've seen that with Infernal Grasp. We've seen it with Cut Down. We've seen it with, All Will Be One had like a 2-mana O-Ring variant. They just keep printing these, right? One cube can only hold so many. And so my big level up was, I can just keep my powder dry. I don't have to swap out the Infernal Grasp for this Shoot the Sheriff or whatever. I can just say, I'm going to wait until the perfect one comes along, because they're just going to keep making them. And the same way with Jackal Pup. Like, I did not test Recruitment Officer. I did not test Cult Conscripts for very long, and I rated it very low. Again, this was because like they're going to keep printing 1-mana creatures with bigger stats than we're used to seeing. I might as well wait for one whose synergies really appeal to me, or like that's exciting for reasons other than its stats. And so I didn't even end up testing most of those, in the same way with the Doom Blades. And so I'm proud of myself that like I recognized, my desire to test these was not necessarily because they were right for my cube. It was just because it was really obvious to see that it was a power upgrade. But I don't actually need those power upgrades to feel like my cube's gameplay is fun.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I do still like the removal spells, selfishly. Yeah, I think we've actually started to get, like, whereas threats have maybe gotten even more complicated and funky over the years, I think we've actually seen a trend of finally getting some of like the really clean removal spells that maybe we've all wanted for a long time. Your Infernal Grasps, your Fells, your Cut Downs, just more sort of clean takes on this effect. And so I welcome all those with open arms. One of the cards that I kind of underrated, but I don't know, I didn't include it in my list because I'm still not super high on it, but I am playing it, is Sheoldred's Edict, which I think is a really elegant way to sort of fix an edict in modern Magic. And I actually added that to my Bun Magic cube after playing with like good old-fashioned Diabolic Edict and Chainer's Edict in my Neoclassical cube, and discovering that actually I really like having a mixture of like targeted removal and edict removal, and it like creates a really interesting texture in terms of like how you want to use things if you know that you have outs to draw to in the form of edicts. And found that just like it just plays really cleanly. Like it is kind of like the 2-mana Doomblade you mostly want in a sort of modern Magic set. So yeah, I didn't include that one because I'd probably call it a 4 or a 5 right now if you were to ask me to rate it, and I just didn't include it in my survey overall. But I am playing it.
I'm glad that they keep printing the Doomblades, I suppose, because that lets me cherry pick. But I'm saying my success is that I started cherry picking rather than staying on the treadmill of just like swapping out each new one that comes in. I love Cut Down and I love Fell. I love the cleanliness of those options. And that means when a new option comes out, even if it's slightly more powerful or its downside is slightly less significant, I'm just not tempted by it anymore.
Love to not be tempted. Resist temptation, Parker. Do you have any final thoughts?
2,100 cards. That's my thought. That was a lot, but we did it.
We did it. We're the greatest, and you're all the greatest if you participated in any of these surveys by sending in results. And another reminder to definitely check out Parker's article. I think that this information is much better delivered through an article than through a podcast where you listen to us talk about it. So that is really where the sort of meat is on this particular subject. We just barely grazed the surface here of things that actually jumped out at us from this era. So you'll have things, I'm sure, that jump out at you and cards that you sort of overlooked and would love to be reminded of, because now is a good time to pick them up for your cube.
Thanks again for everyone who filled out a survey. This analysis would not at all be possible without your contributions over the years. So thank you.
Parker, thank you so much for doing this with me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, the pleasure's all mine. Sorry that Anthony couldn't join us to grouch about everything except Scrapwork Mutt on air.
Yeah, I'm sure if he was here, he would be extolling the virtues of Scrapwork Mutt. Or he would probably say, like, it's great. What else do you want me to say? I don't know. Like, he wouldn't actually have that much to say about it, but he would be saying how great it is, because we stand a Scrapwork Mutt in this home. Mm-hmm. And on that bombshell, that is the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. If you want to support this podcast and all the work we're doing over at Lucky Paper, you can support our Patreon, which is linked in the show notes, which gives you access to a bonus podcast, Magic Doesn't Exist, where Anthony and I can talk about anything we want, as long as it has nothing to do with Magic the Gathering. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and speaking into microphones about it. Parker, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you.